Welcome to this week in our Daniel study. We've reached chapter 4. I hope you have found this book interesting, like I have. We've had some crazy things happen in this book so far. So we set the stage in chapter 1 with the Babylonian Empire coming into Israel and kind of just dominating the nation as a whole. And Daniel and his three friends were carried off into exile. Most of the book covers them in exile in this foreign land, serving in a foreign government that was not their own. In chapter 2, Daniel and his friends went from being about to be executed to actually being promoted to very high up positions in the Babylonian government, all because God gave Daniel the ability to interpret a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, a dream that greatly disturbed him. And then last week with Pastor Wester, you talked about that same king, Nebuchadnezzar, throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into a fiery furnace and God protecting them. And this week we have a chapter that really reminds us of chapter 2, with the king having another dream. This one sent from God again with a specific message for Nebuchadnezzar. And one of the main themes of our chapter today is reflected in this picture next to me. These are words from Nebuchadnezzar himself: "The heavens do rule." So the major theme of our chapter today is the idea that God is in control no matter what. People often convince themselves that they are extremely powerful and very important. A chapter like this reminds us they are only as important as God makes them. They only have as much power as God allows them to have. And Nebuchadnezzar certainly goes through a humbling experience in this chapter. What we're going to do now is, like we did 2 weeks ago, we've got a short video for you to watch. So we'll show that now, we'll edit that in here, and then we'll come back and talk through the chapter when it's done. Okay.
See if I can get this tree frog to jump on my son. Ah, not on me! Ah! Get on me!
Oh, there he goes. There he goes.
Oh, he just... Are you okay?
Yep.
It's nice having the whole mountain to yourself.
Now look in here and you'll see the penny is in, look at that, the penny's in the water. Oh jeez, I can't myself!
All right, welcome back. You had a chance to watch a clip of some people going through some humbling experiences. People in some cases thought they were pretty cool, or thought they were kind of gaming the system, or I'm driving this car really fast and that makes me awesome, and were brought low in different ways. Kind of satisfying in a way to watch those sometimes, because we tend to dislike arrogance and pride, but uncomfortable to watch those videos too, because it reminds us of our own struggles with pride and the times we have maybe thought we were really great or pretty talented in a way or a pretty good person, and then we were humbled in a very uncomfortable way. So keep that thought in mind. Nebuchadnezzar is going to get extremely humbled in our lesson today, and it serves its purpose, serves God's purpose. Let's read through the first couple sections here. So chapter 4, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs! How mighty his wonders! His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. This chapter is a little different. It seems like it's written from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, and it begins with this little superscription from the king saying, the God of Israel is amazing, and what I'm about to tell you is how I learned that firsthand. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. A couple things here. First, so we don't know how long this is after the events of his first dream or after the events of the fiery furnace in chapter 3. But apparently things had really settled down for the king, and he was very content with himself and with his kingdom. His days of war felt like they were over because he had subdued all of his enemies. And so now he's just sort of basking in the glow of himself and how wonderful he is and what a great king he's been. Let's see, just being asked about, asking people about the dream again. Maybe you wonder why doesn't he call in Daniel right away? Knowing how Daniel was able to interpret this dream in chapter 2, why isn't Daniel the first person he calls? We don't know for sure. A couple suggestions that might be possible. One is that Daniel was just busy with something else right now. Two could be that Nebuchadnezzar remembered the last time that Daniel had interpreted his dream. It was amazing that Daniel was able to do it, but also the dream's interpretation had involved Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom collapsing and him with it. So not maybe super eager to have Daniel come in and tell him another kind of disheartening interpretation. Or the third option might be that Daniel's pretty high up in Nebuchadnezzar's chain of command right now. So Daniel is probably aware that all this is going on and perhaps wants to let all these other royal magicians, etc., have their chance and fail, so that when Daniel is finally brought in last and can do it by the power of God, it just stands out to Nebuchadnezzar even more that God is real and these other gods are fake. So a couple of possibilities there. We don't really know for sure. And before we move on, just something that is striking here. So Nebuchadnezzar, the reason he's so happy and contented is because his empire has destroyed really anybody who's dared stand up against him. He's brought down other empires. We talked about that in chapter 2. He sort of brought an end to the Assyrian Empire and kind of put a nail in the coffin of the Egyptian Empire in a way. And Israel had been a great nation, and he destroyed them too. So what makes a king like that afraid? We're told in verse 5, images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So what terrifies a king like this? Well, the real king, the King of Kings, the one who is in heaven. The heavens do rule. All right, let's move on to verse 8. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy God is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. Just stop there for a second. So we've asked ourselves, maybe in chapters 2 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar has witnessed firsthand the power of the true God, the only God of Israel. And we've asked ourselves, has this converted him? Has he seen enough that he says, okay, all these other gods are fake, they're jokers, there's only one true God? Well, his words here to Daniel tell us no. He says spirit of the holy gods, plural. So he's still speaking as one who believes in many gods. Does he believe in the God of Israel? It sure seems so, but doesn't believe that he's the only God. Verse 10. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. So just to stop there briefly. So he has this vision of a giant tree. And it's a tree that's not only magnificent in appearance, but it's also a tree that's providing for all the animals around it. Let's get to verse 13. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger, an angel, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So this giant tree that provides for so many animals around it and has so much abundant fruit is cut down. And Nebuchadnezzar clearly realizes this is him. This is meant for him, because the holy voice switches when it starts talking. It says, "Let him be drenched. Let his be mind changed from that of a man." So this is why he's so terrified. He understands that there's doom being pronounced for him, and maybe hoping that Daniel tells him, "Oh, no, you're all wrong. It's not about you. It's about somebody else. It's about somebody else that's going to try to destroy you, and it's not going to be a problem." Just a note on the animals finding shelter in the tree. At this point, Babylon was, had such influence over the known world at the time. It makes sense that Nebuchadnezzar would be thought of as a tree that has all these animals sheltering in it, because what he said had an impact on so many people in the world. And also he did provide for a lot of the known world at the time. That is something that God does even through terrible pagan rulers like Nebuchadnezzar, is that he provides peace and stability to people that otherwise might not have it. One more, so that the tree is cut down, so clearly something bad is going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. We'll talk about that in the time. Just a word about, so this punishment, these consequences, God says it will happen for 7 times. And note about 7 in the Bible. Sometimes people want to interpret this literally, that for 7 years this bad thing would happen to Nebuchadnezzar, and then it would all go back to normal. Could it have been 7 years? Sure, but it doesn't have to be that. 7 in the Bible is typically a number of completeness. There's the 7 days of creation, and that 7th day God ceases to do his work of creation. 7 just, in lots of ways, we're given the idea that 4 plus 3 equals 7. So 4 being creation, 4 corners of the earth, including humanity. 3 is the triune God. So you put these, 4 plus 3 together, and 7 just is a sign that something is done. It's finished, it's run its course. So when the voice of the angel, and we'll talk more about angels when we meet over the Zoom class, the voice of the angel saying this will happen for 7 times and it will be done, it could just mean that when God decides the time is right, the set time he's put for this sort of consequence for Nebuchadnezzar, then it will be over. Could it be 7 years? Sure. But it also could be shorter or longer than that. So we want to be careful about interpreting these 7s literally when God has not given us the indication that that is so. All right, moving on to the next section. So Daniel interprets a dream. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you." Belteshazzar answered, "My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meanings to your adversaries." So Daniel is perturbed that this applies to a king whom he'd probably grown close to, serving with him all these years. And he says, if only this did apply to someone that was standing up against you, but it's you. Verse 20, "The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting place in its branches for the birds, your majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your majesty saw a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven and saying, 'Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump, bound with iron and bronze, in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. So Daniel makes it clear, this is you, Nebuchadnezzar. This bad thing's going to happen to you. A note there on the repetition of Belteshazzar. So remember that name was given to Daniel. I'll make this a little bigger so it's easier to read for you. So that name Belteshazzar was a Babylonian name. Nebuchadnezzar had given that name to Daniel. His Jewish name, his Israelite name was Daniel. Bel was the chief god of Babylon. So by giving Daniel a name, Belteshazzar, that third bullet point, the implication that was that Bel was stronger than the God of Israel. So by giving him this name, the king was kind of sending a message to Daniel, look, our God is the biggest and baddest God. So I want you to know, whenever you hear this name, Babylon's gods are in control. There's some irony here in the sense that this is being repeated several times, and Nebuchadnezzar, who thinks Bel is so great, is now really at the mercy of the true God of Israel and of Daniel's interpretation. So maybe just a note in the writing there. There's no reason to say Belteshazzar this many times, but perhaps Daniel's including that to indicate the irony of, you think your God is so powerful, how wrong you are. One of the things we'll talk about in the Zoom class is just Daniel's reaction to realizing this dream is about Nebuchadnezzar and realizing that God is going to allow bad things to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. And just he's perplexed by this. And you think of all the bad things Nebuchadnezzar has done, threatened Daniel's life directly in chapter 2, thrown some of his best friends, fellow Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, into a fire and tried to kill them, I should say. And yet, how does Daniel react here? He's perturbed. He doesn't want anything bad to happen to Nebuchadnezzar, which says something about his character and his concern and love for someone who really should have been an enemy. There's a picture here of German and British soldiers kind of holding each other up as they go to get their wounds addressed. And you think of people on the opposite sides of a war being a great example of enemies who would hate each other. And it seems like every great conflict we find stories, anecdotes about people who found a way to love each other and show kindness to each other, even though they should have been enemies. And we see that in Daniel, someone who had been burned by Nebuchadnezzar directly and really would have had great human reason to hate him, instead finds a way to love him. And that's a good thing for us to consider a little bit more. We'll talk that when we meet on Zoom. Let's see. This is the interpretation. Let's go to verse 24. This is the interpretation, your majesty. This is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. A few notes there. So he's going to live like an ox. He's going to be a wild animal living out in the wilderness. And it's a stunning picture of, here's this guy that is, you would imagine has just attention lavished upon him and lives in the finest palace and just has people waiting on his hand and foot, and he's going to go live like an ox. And when Daniel says you'll be drenched with the dew of heaven, and typically animals in the wild are not super concerned about getting rained on. Sometimes they might seek shelter, but a lot of animals just sort of, okay, it's raining, what's the big deal? That's how Nebuchadnezzar is going to live. A person would seek shelter, but as a wild animal, just, okay, it's raining, whatever. There's a couple promises here. One is that this will only last for a time. Those 7 times will be up. And it's indicated, too, by the fact that the stump remains in the ground. The tree is cut down, but the stump remains. And Daniel says, that's an indication you'll be restored after this, but you need to learn a lesson first. And then he points out Nebuchadnezzar's sin seems to have been wickedness to people who were in a rough shape. So somehow Nebuchadnezzar was being unjust or being cruel and not helping those in need. And Daniel highlights that and says, this is a big reason why you're suffering this consequence. what does this tell us about God, that he gives this dream to Nebuchadnezzar in the first place? I mean, that's pretty amazing. He didn't have to. He could have just punished him without warning. But he does give him a warning. So one thing we learn about God is that he's incredibly kind. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, who's gone against God and his people over and over again. And God takes the time to give him this dream and a warning to let him know this bad thing's going to happen. Here's why, and here's how to rectify it. Psalm 2 is a great thing to consider in this section. In Psalm 2, we hear, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain." Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was pretty awesome. And God said, "Oh, you only have as much glory as I allow you to have. You only have as much power and success as I allow you to have." So Nebuchadnezzar, conspires, plots, whatever, and the Lord laughs. The one enthroned in heaven laughs at this. So that's an important thing for us to realize about God. King Nebuchadnezzar, humanly speaking, was the most powerful man on the face of the earth at this time, but not more powerful than God. God very easily brought him low. Okay, let's get to the dream is fulfilled. All this happened. We should say quickly, Daniel giving Nebuchadnezzar some very solid instruction there at the end, essentially telling him to repent. You've sinned. That's the reality. These consequences are going to happen to you because you've sinned. Own it and go to God and find forgiveness. We'll talk about that more when we meet as well. All right, now on to the dream is fulfilled, verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. How long? How long later? 12 months later, a year later. So a year after this dream is interpreted, Nebuchadnezzar experiences the consequences. As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Looks like Nebuchadnezzar has not learned his lesson at all. It's been a year since he heard this dream, a year since he realized that he would be humbled by God, and still demonstrating this attitude that was the problem in the first place. Verse 31, even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. Oh man, can you imagine how terrifying this would be? And what just a roller coaster of emotions from feeling very proud of yourself. Kind of imagine Nebuchadnezzar on the balcony of his palace, looking down over Babylon and just so proud of himself. And before he could even finish these words, a voice from heaven says, "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Wow, that's crazy, isn't it? Let's just talk about Babylon for a second. Was Babylon actually great? It certainly seems that way. In terms of city planning, Babylon, the city of Babylon seemed to be way ahead of its time. Here's a picture of what it may have looked like. They had all these rectangular grids in their roads with these little kind of mini neighborhoods all named after Babylonian gods, so that the city was very well laid out. You see at the top of that picture there, the summer palace, so you could see how Nebuchadnezzar may have been in that palace overlooking his city and just marveling at it. One of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it seems, were there and brought there to kind of, it was said, I believe it was Nebuchadnezzar, that one of his wives, his foreign wives, was homesick, and so he brought these different plants from her homeland to this area so she could walk through these gardens and feel like she was more at home. Is that all completely accurate? I don't know, but it is a good story. It's certainly, if it's true, it certainly is representative of Nebuchadnezzar's power and ingenuity, and at least having people that could get things done for him. There was a system of canals that would bring in water from the Tigris and Euphrates. So just, you think about people living in 500 BC, and we typically think of them living in a very simplified, almost crude way. And here are these people that figured out how to divert water and bring it into their city. And then the last thing maybe to point out is just it was uncovered these 20-foot thick walls that the city of Babylon was surrounded by, 2 walls that were each 20 feet thick. So was Babylon great? Was its empire great? Yeah, for sure. So from a human standpoint, did Nebuchadnezzar have reason to be proud and arrogant? We would say absolutely. And because he feels that way, God brings him low. He goes insane, temporarily insane, and believes that he is an animal, and goes and lives out in the wilderness like an ox. So you just imagine this king, this very, in many ways, dignified king, very powerful king, and now he's out in the wilderness, and his hair grows long, and you imagine pretty gross, and his nails aren't cut, and they get long like the claws of a bird. So just this mess of a human being, and what a transition from this haughty man to a man who forgets that he's a man and thinks that he's an animal. In our Zoom classes, we'll talk about more about what we're tempted to take credit for in our lives. Nebuchadnezzar was tempted to take credit for his success and for his material gain, and God said, no. That's not at all true. So maybe as you get ready for that class, or maybe if you're just doing this on your own, think to yourself, what are you most tempted to take credit for in your life, materially, physically, emotionally, spiritually? What do you look at in your life and say, man, I've done a really good job at that? And what could we stand to gain from saying, no, that wasn't me. That was all a blessing from God. Whatever talents, abilities, time I've given to that, God gave it to me in the first place. All right, let's finish here. Let's see, that would be verse 34. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. So he remembers that he's a person. Let's see if you find this response surprising. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. So it sounds a lot like the superscription at the beginning of this chapter. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Surprising response from Nebuchadnezzar. What else could he do, I suppose? You think he could have been very mad at God, but when you realize what God could do to him like that, probably the best course of action is to admit you were wrong, like he does here, and confess that I am incredibly weak in comparison to this powerful God who does whatever he pleases him with the entire powers of heaven at his disposal. Just a few final thoughts here. What do we learn about consequences? Well, God often uses consequences to humble us intentionally, not to laugh at us and not to say, isn't that funny that their lives are rougher? But most of all, God wants us to be close to him and to lean on him and rely on him. And if consequences help us get there, thank God that he does that. Thank you, God, for doing whatever it takes to get us close to you, because being close to you and trusting in you is really the key to an eternity in heaven. God's promises, God keeps his promise to this heathen king. He says this punishment is only going to last for a time, and he keeps that promise. So it's good for us to realize too, God keeps his promises to us, and he keeps his promises to people who don't even really know him or trust in him, like Nebuchadnezzar. And then finally, maybe two things for you to consider. One, is this true faith here? What Nebuchadnezzar says here, read it closely, determine, is Nebuchadnezzar a Christian? And we'll talk about that in the Zoom class. You can think through that for yourself. If you can't make the Zoom classes, if it doesn't work for you, you can send me an email. Let me know what you think, and we can talk through that. And the last one is something to consider too. Number 10 in the sheet says, there's no record of these events in Babylonian history books, which makes it a target for critics. They insist that it obviously didn't happen. Come up with one reason why it may not be found in the history books. So we believe that it happened because God says that it did. But you can imagine how critics look at that and say, well, the Babylonians didn't write about this, and this is a pretty big deal that for a time their king went insane and thought that he was an ox and then came back and it was even better than before. Come up with a reason that you think of maybe this wouldn't be found in the Babylonian history books. Same thing. We'll talk about in the class if you can join us, but if you can't, send me an email and we can discuss it back and forth. I'm interested in what you think. All right, that's all for this week's lesson, chapter 4. Again, major concepts here. God is in control, even over the people that seem most powerful in this world. He's completely sovereign. And when we get a little too big for our britches, so to speak, God is very willing to lovingly humble us, and thank God that he does that. All right, God bless your study.